Hi, my name is David Tate. I'm the director of the online certificate program here at Truett Seminary. I'd like to talk with you today about what your authors are calling the Interpretive Journey. This is the 5-step process that they've put together to help you go, to help me go, to help all of us go from what Joel Gregory calls the thenness of Scripture into the nowness of our congregations and communities. This is the journey that we're trying to take, to go from the then to get to the now. In order to do so, they've broken it down into 5 steps. And we're going to go through each of these steps in a way that I hope will help you understand better what you're going to be doing through this course. So let's start with step 1. This is grasping the text in their town. So we're going to start, typically, when we're going to approach Scripture, we're going to do so by studying a verse. This verse is going to be the subject, or this passage is going to be the subject for our Sunday school lesson, for our sermon, for our conversation, or for our own personal study. And we're going to look at this particular passage. It might be 1 verse, it might be 2 verses, it might be a whole chapter. But typically speaking, we're going to be studying a small portion. And what we have to do is we have to, in the process of studying this small portion, grasp what that message looked like for the original audience and for the town that they lived in. And so while we might be studying this one particular little subject, we need to understand that subject in the context of everything else in that town, in their town. So this is going to be in Babylon for the people of God who are in exile. This is going to be in Jerusalem for Jesus' conversations with people leading up to his crucifixion. This is going to be all throughout the area of first century Christianity as Paul is going out through the mission field and as all of these early churches are getting started. And so as we're going to be doing that, we're going to be looking at how that passage would have been understood to its original audience. Now, the original audience, we have to remember, may not have been Christian. They may have been Jewish. They may have had their own context in Scripture. So it's really easy, particularly as we read the Gospels, to think that Jesus is talking to people who are Christians. But often he's talking to people who are followers of God and do so within the Old Testament law and Jewish faith. So we're going to understand the historical and literary context of the original audience. This is going to require us to first study the surrounding passages. We're going to look at maybe the chapter. Maybe we're going to then look at the book. We might then begin to look at the broader context of everything. We first have to grasp everything in their town. As you're going to learn how to do this, the important thing that you need to do is you need to be specific. Your observations about all of this, as you write and as you reflect and as you look, you need to concentrate on being specific. What is it that you are seeing and noticing and grasping in all of this? How are you going to bring the meaning of this passage out into a clear and concise, specific statement of what they would have understood about that passage? Once you've done this, this is step 1. In the interpretive journey. Step 1 in the interpretive journey. Now, step 2, what we have to do is we have to then look at what divides us from the then into the now. And the authors of your book are going to call this the width of the river. So let's presume for a moment there's a river that winds our way between the then and the now. We need to see how far apart, how far is this river? We're going to have to build a bridge from one side to the other. We need to know how big does our bridge need to be. So we have to look at what is the context of where they were then. And then we have to look at how does that relate to the context of where we are now. This is the width of the river. This is going to vary from passage to passage. Some passages, this river might be very narrow. Other passages, this might be a very, very wide river. And we're going to have to really work hard to find those theological principles that connect us from one side to the other, from the then to the now. The next step, the next major step, there's 3 major steps, 1, 3, and 5. The next step is now we've got to build a bridge We know what the width of the river is, and now we're going to build a bridge from one side to the other. Let's give it some rails so we don't fall off, but the goal is to get from the then to the now. This is the principalizing bridge. This is the theological principle that was true here, that was absolutely understood here, that we can then use to bring this passage into the now. So this is the principle that gets us from here to there. So while the river is step 2, the bridge is step 3. This is a major step. This is the way in which we're able to go from the then to the now. This principalizing bridge, this needs to be something that is concrete. It needs to be something that is specific. It needs to be something that takes into account the differences between the then and the now. For example, in the Promised Land, and this is from your book, there was unique aspects of the situation in Joshua 1, verses 1 through 9. The people of God are there. They're about to enter the Promised Land. Moses has just died. Joshua has been appointed to take his place. And Joshua then God speaks to Joshua to encourage him to be strong and courageous, to encourage him in the challenging road that is going to be ahead in the Promised Land. As we read that passage from Joshua, we're going to be reading it while we are over here. Now, there might be need for us to be strong and courageous, but we are not going to be in the same place getting ready as the people of God to enter into the Promised Land. So for that, perhaps that river might be large or small, depending on how we're going to go about talking about it. But the whole goal is to discover the intended meaning of this author, to then bring it forward to be able to recognize what it is in the modern era, in your particular context. We have to look for the differences. We have to look for the similarities. In this principalizing bridge, this is focused on the similarities. Okay, let's move forward. This principalizing bridge you'll want to write out in probably 1 to 2 sentences. This is the hard part. We need to be specific here about what we're observing about the early church, what we're observing about the people of God in the Old Testament. And as we bring it forward here, those specifics then have to turn into 1 to 2 sentences. That is the theological principle. If you look in your book, you'll see some examples of how to do that. That principle should be timeless. It should have been the same here as it will be here where we are. The next thing that we have to do is we have to see, where does this bridge fit in the context of all of the other bridges that have been made across the time from Old Testament, from New Testament to where we are now. So we're going to consult the biblical map. We're going to look at how that theological principle fits in the context of everything else that is going on in Scripture. Because if we come up with a theological principle that does not hold faithful to all of the other context of Scripture, then we've got something wrong in our theological principle. We have to be sure that that principle is accurate and that it is in context of everything else that we know about Scripture. So we look at the biblical map. We look at what Scripture says about this subject, what Scripture says about that principle. Consulting the biblical map. In the process of doing this, what we have to be careful about as we form our theological principle is we need to be careful to avoid what we're going to call preformed messages. This is a message that you've said, you know what, I want to talk about this over here. And so I've got this idea. I want to talk about such and such. And then what I'm going to do is, whether consciously or subconsciously, I'm going to bring that message to Scripture. So that as I then study Scripture, I'm going to be looking for this message. The problem with that is, as we're looking at Scripture, what is the number one thing that is in our minds? This thing that we came up with. That then puts us over Scripture rather than under it where we're supposed to be. So if we're going to have a preformed message, we need to let that go. We need to set that aside. We need to approach Scripture to look at what Scripture truly says. So in the process of consulting the biblical map, it ought to fit this theological principle. It ought to correlate with the rest of Scripture. And at the end of that step of looking at how it fits in with the rest of the biblical map, we might need to reword this slightly. We might need to change it or shift it or give it some sort of specific nuance in order to fit into the rest of Scripture. Lastly, we're going to get to the final step. This is grasping the text in our town. So we're going to then have to know what our town looks like, the issues that are being dealt with in our community, the issues that are being dealt with in our congregation. This is what we're trying to do, to go from the then and to get to the now with three major steps. That first step, that third step, and lastly, this fifth step. Grasping the text in our town, this is how individual Christians, this is how the church corporately should live out this text, should live out this theological principle. How does this principle apply in real life situations? Trying to be as specific as possible. In each moment, we need to be specific. We're not going to be talking in general terms. So hopefully in this, you can see a little better what your authors are trying to get you to do. We're going to spend a lot of time here on this step one, because this is the part where we're encountering holy text, where we're encountering holy scriptures. This is the part where we are studying the words of our ancestors in the faith, of Paul and of the authors of the Old Testament and of the gospel writers. This is where we're going to be encountering scripture and encountering Christ in Scripture. This is where we're going to learn most how to do this. This flows out of step one by looking at first the width of the river. That step three then leads into step four of looking at the context within all of Scripture, which then leads us finally to step five, where we get that specific application. Hopefully, this will help you begin to think in broad picture about what you're going to be learning how to do within this course. Thank you for your time. God bless.